guys, welcome to my first video tutorial. I thought for this week to kind of shift gears a little bit that we would try some observational drawing for a change. Now I know you guys are all cooped up at home, and this is a little bit of an experiment on my part, as I haven't done a video tutorial quite like this before. So I'm going to do my best to speak very clearly and run through things as efficiently as I can. If you get lost, you can always pause the video and go back. But today we're going to be covering self-portraiture, which can be a pretty daunting task for most folks when it comes to getting into drawing for the first time. And I know a lot of you guys are very experienced. Some may have taken drawing classes or other studio classes where you've done portraiture or observational drawing before. But I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible right now, just so that we're all on the same page. So for this assignment, you're going to have the option of, I would say, any size paper you'd like with a minimum of 8.5 by 11. So that's an ordinary sheet of computer paper. I'm actually going to be working on this heavier duty watercolor paper because I don't have any Bristol board on hand. Bristol board is certainly an option, but if you don't have those materials, you can always work with something as cheap as a sheet of cardstock. If you're really in a pinch, I'd say computer paper is fine as well. I'm just sharpening my pencils right now. I have two with me. A lot of my supplies are stuck at school. I'm not going to be able to access any of that stuff until about May 5th, when they're letting us come on campus for about 30 minutes to pick up material. So hopefully I should be able to grab the portfolio that contains all of the work that you submitted prior to this COVID-19 situation. Well, I'm not going to speak to that too much. More information on that forthcoming. But anyways, I have two pencils, just an ordinary number 2 pencil, and a 2B pencil, which is going to be a little bit softer. So this one you might have to sharpen a little bit more often, just because it is a softer graphite. And the nice thing about this pencil, though, is that you can actually yield some pretty dark lines with it. I'm sure with some of the previous assignments you've had some experience working with a pencil this soft, or maybe even softer. But I'd say these two would be a good pair to start with. If you have your 2H pencil, you could do a 2H and a 2B, or a 3H, something that's a little bit harder, especially for the preliminary mark making that you're going to be doing. So we're going to be starting off the drawing with this one, because again, it's a harder graphite and it's going to yield a lighter, softer line than this one, which can be used for shading. So get into a position where you're comfortable. I'm just sitting in my dining room table here, just for the sake of demonstration. There's a nice light coming in. Light is very important. We're going to be building on light and shadow once we get the basic structure worked out at first. So I'm going to go ahead and sharpen my pencil. And this is going to be an observational drawing, as I mentioned before, so you want to make sure that you have a hand mirror. This can be a mirror that sits upright, which would be ideal. Or you can use something like this, just a regular hand mirror with a handle. The only disadvantage to working with a mirror like this is that you will have to hold it up while you're working, which can be a bit cumbersome, especially if you're trying to focus in on what you're doing in the drawing. So this is another option that you have, something like this, which I think I bought at Target or something for about $5. And this works nice. One side's a little bit more magnified than the other. And I'm going to go ahead and set this upright, and I'm going to position it so that I can see my head and my shoulders. So I want to be able to see both of those things in the mirror, because we're going to be starting with something more along the lines of what we did with blind contour the very first day of class. So I have my mirror situated here. I can look back and forth between what I see in my reflection and what I'm seeing on the paper rather easily. But I always tell my students you want to be spending about 70 to 80% of your time looking at your subject. In this case, it's going to be your reflection, and then the other 20 to 30% of your time looking at your drawing to check your work. Because a lot of times what happens is we'll look at our subject, we'll think we understand our subject, and then we go to do the drawing, and we start to invent things that we think were there in our reflection or in our subject that aren't actually there. So the more that you can be going back and forth between your subject, again, in this case, your reflection and your drawing, the more you're going to be able to have your hand and your eye working in tandem with one another, basically. So what I want to do first is I want to establish a sense of scale. So I'm just going to be making a few preliminary tick marks across my paper just to sort of operate as placeholders for future work that I'm going to be developing as I move forward. So I have my mirror set up. First things first, I'm going to go ahead and make a mark at the top of the paper for the crown of my head. And then I'm going to go about 60% down towards the bottom, or about 2/3 the way down to the bottom, and make a small mark for my chin. So if you look really closely, there's a mark right there, and there's a mark at the very top. Oop. There we go, right up there for my head. So I can already tell about what scale the drawing is going to be, or the head's going to be, rather. Okay, so now that I have a little mark for the top of my head and the bottom of my chin, I'm just going to make a couple more little marks for my neck and shoulders. So what we have so far, and again, it's a little hard to see, so forgive me, are some marks for the neck and the shoulders. Okay. Next thing that I want to do is I want to approximate the shape of the head. So again, I'm spending more of my time looking at my subject in the mirror, and then just kind of checking my work on the paper. And it's not really important that things are accurate in this stage. We're really building things right now. You know, if we're thinking about a sculptor working with a piece of clay, for instance, they're not going to start by sculpting the details of the eye, or the nostril, or any of those small things. We want to really sort of carve out the preliminary structure first. So already I have a pretty decent structure here to imagine where information is going to go as I continue to draw and build and develop the drawing. So next thing I want to do is I want to establish where my eyes are going to go. And one misconception is that a lot of people, when they start portraiture, have a tendency to think that the eyes are about 70% up towards the top of the head or the crown of the head, when in fact really our eyes fall about halfway between the crown of the head and the bottom of the chin. So I can just go ahead and just very lightly put in a line across the head. See if I can see that. I know it's a little difficult to see. You look at that horizontal line, that's about halfway down. You can always use a measuring device if you need to, like a ruler or a yardstick. I'm just eyeballing it. I've done this a few times, so I already know that where I place that horizontal line is already about halfway between the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. So, and again, we're not going to be putting any details in at this stage. We're just trying to sort of map things out, okay? So the goal of this project is to try and accurately portray what you're seeing in your reflection. So just do the best that you can. I understand that everybody's at varying levels of ability. So if you're not that comfortable with an assignment like this, just do the best you can. I'm going to really try to work with you to make sure that you understand the process so that your drawings get better. That's really the ultimate goal. So next thing I'm going to do, now that I have my my eye line in there, is I'm just going to rough in a sort of triangular shape for the nose, and that's going to start about halfway between the left and the right hand side. So I'm putting that shape in, and if you need to, for an additional guide, just to figure out exactly where halfway between the left and right side is just go ahead and draw a vertical line down across from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin. So you have almost like crosshairs to sort of work with as a guide. A lot of cartoonists use that for expressions, especially if you're trying to do something complicated like draw a head from like a 3/4 profile kind of view, that sort of thing. We're working directly here, but you know, if it does help you place the features, then it's useful, and I would say definitely put that in there. But if you're a little bit more comfortable or more advanced, you don't necessarily need that. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in an elliptical shape for my mouth. So that's going to be about halfway from the tip of the nose to the bottom of the chin. And I'm going to have to draw things a little bit darker, just so they show up in the video a little bit better. I know the lighting in here isn't perfect, but I'll try to make it visible for you so that it's manageable when you're watching the video if you wanted to follow along, for instance. So, okay, back to the mouth. I'm going to go ahead and draw that elliptical shape again, about halfway between the tip of the nose and that chin line that I put in there. And you'll notice as I'm drawing right now, you know, because I'm just blocking things in, you know, they look rather generic. You can see, you know, just sort of, you know, as a very general sort of aesthetic at this point. There's not a whole lot of descriptive information because, again, we're carving things out gradually. You know, we want to focus on the big features first and then sort of whittle away at that until we get to the minor details that we can then make adjustments to. So the problem with, you know, starting with something like the eye, for instance, is that, you know, if we get into a drawing and we're, you know, doing the best eye that we think we could possibly draw, and we're getting all the shading, the contour lines of the eye, everything perfect. You know, say I spend 20 minutes or half an hour on it, I'm going to be less likely to want to erase it or move it or make any changes to it if I need to. You know, the important thing here is that you want to be able to make changes as frequently as possible to any of the aspects of your drawing that need it. And if I'm overcommitting to something too early, I'm not only going to be unwilling or less willing to change it, but you know, it may not be right. It may not work with the rest of the drawing, even if it's, say, the best looking eye I've ever drawn. You know, if it doesn't fit with the rest, it's not going to be right. So I try to commit as little as possible to you know, many of these features in the very beginning as I can. Because, again, I don't know exactly where things are going to go yet. I'm just making approximations. So keep that in mind. Don't, you know, if you find yourself getting caught up in the early stages of the drawing and doing too many details, try to pull yourself out of that area and, you know, focus on another aspect of the drawing that might need your attention. So you'll notice that the scale of my head is rather large, and that's because I'm working with this 18 by 24 inch paper, which is, you know, a larger format. So I'm doing larger than life size here, which is totally appropriate for the size of the paper. You know, if I did my head life size on a sheet of paper this large, I'd have a lot of empty negative space. So if you think about composition, you know, we want to make a drawing that's scaled appropriately for the size of our paper. You know, if I'm doing a drawing that's just 8.5 by 11, might have to go a little bit smaller than life size. So just keep that in mind. If you want to work larger, you might need to scale the head larger to accommodate the paper size that you're using. Otherwise, again, you're going to have a lot of space to contend with that you're not going to necessarily know what to do with. So just be wary of that. Okay, so now that I have the top of the head, the bottom of the chin, I have a roughed in neck and shoulders as well as nose and mouth. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my ears. So just like I did the little marks for the top and the bottom of the head, I'm going to do the same thing for the ears. So I'm noticing if I'm looking directly into my mirror that my earlobes come just a little bit below the tip of my nose. So I'm just going to go ahead on the left and right side of the paper, draw little tick marks just slightly underneath where I put the tip of the nose with that initial triangular shape that I drew. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm noticing that the tops of my ears come up to about where my eyebrows are. So I haven't put those in yet, but I'm going to say that's going to be a little bit higher than that horizontal line that I put in there for the eye line. So this information will actually help inform where the eyes are placed as well. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So put the top of the ears, a little mark on each side there. Okay, next thing I want to do, and this part's really important, is the hairline. So I have pretty short hair. You might have longer hair or hair that's styled in any number of different ways, and that's that's fine. But one thing that's really important is the hairline. So if I'm talking about the crown of my head, that's going to be the very top, that contour edge. You can't really see it because it's on a frame, but right up here, that's the crown. We want to figure out where our hairline goes because that's going to help carve into the head and make that eye line that we put in make a little bit more sense. So I'm just going to be looking, and again, spending more time looking in my reflection than I am looking at my drawing, but sort of paying attention to my periphery, what's going on the paper as I'm drawing. So I'm sort of following along. You can almost imagine an invisible dot moving around the contour lines of your face, and you want that to be moving with your hand. So I'm trying to basically follow the way that my eye is moving in the mirror with my hand that's drawing. I've just noticed I'm working with that darker pencil, but again, I needed to make this a little bit more visible. But again, at this stage, you could still be working with like a 2H or a 3H, just to make sure everything's nice and light, and again, easy to navigate or edit or erase or make changes if you need to. If you go too dark with this one, it's gonna be a little bit more difficult to cover up your mistakes. So go ahead and put in my hairline. I'm also noticing my sideburns come down about 2/3 the way down towards the bottom of my ear on each side. And again, in this stage, things are still going to look rather generic because I'm just being really loose and just trying to approximate everything. So let me hold this up here, have you take a look and see what you think. All right. So we can see that hairline now helps make that line that I put in there for the eyes make just a little bit more sense. Okay. So next thing that can be really challenging when beginning portraiture, if this is your first attempt, or maybe you've done a few before and had some challenges, is the placement of the eyes. A lot of people say, well, how do you make sure that the eyes are lined up or on the same level? And that horizontal line that I put in there earlier is going to assist with that. That allows us to imagine where placement of the eyes on the left and the right side are going to go. That way, I make sure that they're lined up. So I'm just going to do a simple kind of almond or elliptical shape here. It's really more important to think about the eye socket than the eye itself. If you're just strictly thinking about the white of the eye, the iris, and the pupil, without considering the socket that they inhabit, it's not going to really tell you anything about the structure or the planes of the face. So you do want to think about the eyebrows, underneath the eye, the eyelids, the socket. All of that is really helpful. If you had if you did a Google search of a skull, like an anatomic skull, that can oftentimes assist with having an understanding of the structure that lies underneath the skin. So if that would be helpful for you, I would definitely suggest looking something like that up. Not necessary. Again, if you just want to follow along with me and do the best you can, that's great. All right, so like I said, it's sort of elliptical or almond shape. And in terms of how far the eyes are placed to the left and the right side of the face, one thing that you can think about is if I were to just draw in the nostrils real quick on the left and the right side of that little triangle that I made for the nose earlier. The inside of the eyes are actually going to align with the tips of the nostrils. So if I were to, say, draw a plumb line down from the inside corners of my eyes down, it would touch the sides of my nose. So what I can do is actually, once I draw the nostrils in there, draw a couple vertical lines above them, and that can help me figure out how close the eyes need to be to one another. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in there, and then I'll hold this up so you guys can take a look and see what you think. Okay. All right, you see those vertical lines above the nostrils there? So that's going to tell me that those almond shapes that I put in for the eyes need to come in just a little bit closer. Another thing that helps as well is the eye spacing between one another is going to be about one eye as a unit of measurement space between one another. So I should be able to fit one of the eyes that I've drawn in there in between the two. So along with that alignment with the nostrils, I should be able to fit one of the eyes in my drawing space between the two, and that's going to tell us about where the eyes need to be placed. Now, it's not an exact science. Most of our faces aren't perfectly symmetrical, so you'll want to make sure that you're observing in your mirror first. But in a general sense, you could say that the eyes are about one eye's width apart from one another. So, like I said, I'm just going to move in those initial sort of elliptical almond shapes. And I'm noticing that the drawing's getting just a little bit cluttered because I am having to draw on top of the previous marks, and that's okay. It's actually better, I would say, to have more marks on the paper than less, because the more marks that you have, even if things aren't accurate, the more information that you have to work with to narrow things down to get them closer to what you see directly in observation. So keep that in mind. You know, if you're not sure, there's a part of your drawing you go, well, it just doesn't feel right. That's okay. At least it gives you something to work with. The thing you want to be worried about is the empty space of the paper, because we can only speculate so much as to what needs to go in that empty space. So keep that in mind. The more marks you make, even if they're not accurate, are going to help you build the drawing and make it feel or appear more realized. Okay. So I could even just go ahead and lightly draw in one of those eyes in between the two, just to make sure I'm being accountable for that placement or that spacing. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and take my eraser. If you have a gum eraser or a kneaded eraser, either one of those would be sufficient for this. Again, the line should be pretty nice and light. Now I'm just going to clean up some of the stuff that I don't really need anymore. And in fact, I can actually go ahead and completely erase that horizontal eye line that I put in at the beginning of the drawing, just to make it a little bit cleaner and make it less confusing when I continue to build the drawing moving forward. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And I don't really think I need that vertical line anymore. Feel free to leave that as a guide if you do need it. That's totally fine. It can help some people. It can be confusing if if it's too heavy. So again, if it's nice and light, that's fine. Otherwise, go ahead and use your eraser and just pull up some of that information. All right, so we're going to clean it up a little bit. Sort of looks like a kind of mutant space alien with 3 eyes right now, but that's okay. That's perfectly fine for this very early stage of the drawing. So I don't want to drag this on for too long because I know this can be a lot, but we are going to continue to cover some of the things that I think are important to bring this thing a little bit closer to what I'm seeing in my reflection. So I noticed my mirror shifted a little bit, just moving it back into place. So you do want to kind of pay attention to the perspective that you're looking at to make sure that if things do move, that you're not drawing them in 2 simultaneous places, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. So if we were to just think back to what we've done so far, we've put in the initial shape of the head, neck, and shoulders with the placement of the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. I have the hairline drawn in there, and I have marks for my ears. So I have a really great building block for additional information that's going to make the drawing look more or closer to my likeness. Okay. All right. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to start to get just a little bit more specific than we have so far. So the lips, for instance, I got to go ahead and close my mouth for a minute just so I can draw those in. You can decide whatever expression you want to have in the drawing. I'm just going to go for something very basic and very plain, but I'm going to close my mouth so I can draw some of the contours in. But you can go ahead and make adjustments to that initial elliptical shape that you made to the specific contours of your upper and your lower lip. Okay, so I'm going to do that right now, and then I'll hold this up so you can take a look at it. Okay. All right, now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and hold this up so you can take a look. And one thing that I didn't mention was that the cleft of the chin is going to be important to talking about the planes of the lips. So we notice that our lips actually protrude out from our face. And if I'm just focusing on the lips and I'm not focusing on the surrounding area, it's just going to look flat or sort of pasted onto the face as opposed to a part of the entire structure. So, for instance, right underneath my lower lip here, I'll notice that it protrudes inwards and then comes out to the chin. So I'm just going to make a little bit of a horizontal mark underneath the chin for that, and that's going to help. Another thing too that you can use as a guide is the corners of the lips. So the corners of the lips, if we were to make another plumb line or a vertical line going upwards, and I'll go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to go from the edge of the lips vertical, just really nice and light, is that line is going to actually intersect with the middle of your eye. So by drawing that line up through the shapes of the eye that I put in there, or the shapes of the eyes rather, excuse me, that's going to help me figure out where the iris and the pupil need to go. So now that I have those two vertical lines, I can go ahead and draw in the shape of the iris. And just very approximately, I'm just drawing really nice and light little marks in a circular fashion for the iris. And while I'm at it, I might as well just go ahead and go a little bit darker and draw an inner circle for the pupils. Right now I'm noticing, because of some of the light coming in from the room, the pupils have a tendency to shrink a little bit, and that's fine. If you're someone like me that wears glasses, you could choose to omit them if you want. They can be challenging just in terms of the refraction that we see. It does create kind of a distortion when we look in the mirror. I'm just going to go ahead and ignore my glasses for the sake of this demonstration, because I don't want to waste time for people that don't wear glasses. That's not going to really be useful for this tutorial. So I have a little bit of a deer in headlights kind of look going on right now, so we'll show you that. And that's because I don't have any reference to the eye socket or the eyelids or the eyebrows or anything like that. And we're going to take care of that next. Okay. All right. So now that I have that shape of the eye, I have a little bit more descriptive information in there. I'm noticing that there's a little bit of some bags under my eyes, probably from a little bit of sleep deprivation. I'm sure you've all been there. But I want to make sure that I reference that a little bit, because that is going to tell us about the planes of the face, as I mentioned before. The cheekbones, the forehead. The information surrounding the eyes will actually describe the planes of the face. Okay, so once I put those bags underneath my eyes, I'm going to go above my eyes into the forehead and just carve in the shape of my eyebrows. And eyebrows are kind of tricky because everyone has different eyebrows. Some of them are bushier, some of them are a little bit more slender. But you want to just pay really close attention to the way or the shape of the eyebrows as you're drawing, because that can really alter the expression of the face. And if they're not accurate, it can throw the entire drawing off. So I'm just paying really close attention. I'm not drawing really dark right now. I'm just very lightly laying in the initial lines so that I can have a better understanding of how to move forward from here. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and you can do the same thing as well. All right, next thing I want to do is I want to focus on the upper lids of my eyes. And that's going to tone it down a little bit, make the eyes appear a little bit less surprised. That's certainly a look. But if you're going for accuracy and you're going for a more, serious expression, you want to make sure that you take care of that. So I'm going to just go ahead and carve into that elliptical shape on each side for each of the eyes, just to make sure that, they don't look like my eyes are super wide and a little bit less surprised than they have been up until this point. And you'll notice a dramatic difference once I do that. Okay. All right, and it looks like this is probably a good time for me to get rid of those vertical plumb lines that I put in there from the edges of the mouth up to the center of the eyes. So if you still need it as a guide, feel free to leave it for now. But I'm just going to go ahead and erase that because it's a little bit too much information visually right now. I don't really think it's necessary at this stage now that I've already placed the eyes. Okay. All right, I'll show you what I got here. And in a minute, I'm going to go ahead and erase that third eye that I have that's floating in the center of the face. Okay, so this is what we have so far. Again, you know, it has a tendency to look a little bit more generic, and that's okay. We still have a little bit of work left to do to clean things up and make them a little bit more accurate to what we're seeing in a reflection. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and erase that eye. Make sure I have the right pencil here because the other one doesn't have an eraser. And I still have those plumb lines from the edge of the nostrils here, but I'm going to leave those for now because they do help me see the structure of the nose a little bit better before I carve into it more specifically. Okay, so I erased that center eye here. Now is a great time to address the nose. It's a little bit difficult to see with these Coke bottle lenses going on here, but I will do the best that I can. All right, so I'm noticing from this angle, I see just a little bit of a flare of the nostril. You know, I don't have this mirror up right at eye level, so I am seeing things, you know, slightly from below looking up, and that's fine. You can always adjust your head position. But if you have a little bit of a flare of the nostril, that's going to make it appear like you're looking directly in the mirror, straight on, as opposed to looking down or looking up, that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put the flare in on each side. And those nostril flares will actually help you describe the tip of the nose a little bit more. So that flare on either side does help us structure the tip of the nose. And with that in mind, I'm just going to go ahead and do a sort of a rounded stroke above the nose to show how it protrudes out in space a little bit further than everything else. And feel free to do the same. And again, you don't want to be approximating here. You want to make sure that you're spending a good amount of your time looking at your subject, or at least making that connection back and forth between your hand and your eye. So the mirror and then what you see on the paper. Okay, so the more you're doing that, the more effective the drawing is going to be, and ultimately the more of a likeness that you'll be able to accomplish. Okay, and that's what we're looking for with this one. Not for every drawing, but in the case of an observational drawing, these are some of the steps that really do assist us in getting a closer likeness or a stronger resemblance. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to just sort of carve into that initial triangular shape a little bit to describe the bridge of the nose, and also that'll help me provide a little bit more descriptive information about the eye socket, the eye sockets on both sides. All right, now we're in a good place to go ahead and erase those vertical plumb lines that intersect with the corners, the inside corners of the eyes, because we don't need them at this point. We already have the flare of the nose, and we have the placement of the eyes, so it's not really going to do us any good to leave those lines at this stage. Okay, so we'll check in again and show you what we got. A lot less surprise, too, with the eyes at this point, right? Good. All right, so I'm noticing a few other things that haven't been addressed yet. One of those things is the ears. We have the tick marks on the top and the bottom of the ears, but we don't have the specific contours. So go ahead and pay close attention to what you look at in the mirror and just draw the exterior contour. What I'm noticing is from the tip of the ears, I have a sort of curving shape that comes down a little bit in towards my sideburns and then flares out at the lobe of my ear. So I'm going to be nice and light with this one and just draw that shape in. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and make an adjustment to the contour of the jawline and the chin, because I'm noticing right now it's looking a little hazy and it's hard to see the distinguishing features. So you want to make adjustments to that jawline and make sure that you're following the specific contours of the jawline, because if that's off, it is going to throw everything else off and decrease the resemblance to what you're actually seeing in your reflection. So if you need to, you may have drawn it right the first time. I know I rarely get it right the very first time, So, a lot of it is sort of carving it out with line, seeing how it looks, and then making the necessary adjustments to bring it closer to, what I'm actually seeing in reality. So feel free to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and make a little bit of an adjustment after I did the ears to that jawline. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and draw a slightly angled line on the left and right side of my neck here, just to make it a bit more prominent than it's been up until this point. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust the jawline on the right side as well, based on what I'm looking at. Just needs to come out a little bit more. Okay, now I'm noticing that there needs to be a little bit of an adjustment above the lips. So if we think about our lips, as I mentioned before about the eye sockets, the lips do, they exist on a plane that's varied from the rest of the planes of the face. So the eye sockets go in, they recede into the head. The lips protrude out from the face. And so it's not just about drawing the lips accurately, but drawing the surrounding area so that we have a better understanding of the structure of the face. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in the cleft of my lip, and then I'm going to make some marks around here and here on my face just to describe the planes of the cheekbones a little bit better. And it's going to be a little bit more prominent than it will be in the final iteration of this drawing, but right now I think that's going to help guide me as I'm continuing to make additional marks or add additional descriptive information. Alright, another thing that I'm noticing right now is that while I drew in my hairline, I didn't draw in the contours of the outside of my hair. So that's something that I want to address next, because right now the head in the drawing is looking a little bit too rounded off on the top. If you look at what we have here, it's still that initial preliminary rounded shape that we had before, and that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you have whether it's thinner hair like me or thicker, coarser hair. There is going to be a more specific shape that's going to tell you about how the hair actually rests on the skull. So go ahead and make the necessary adjustments based on what you observe from the crown of the head onto the sides of the head with the hair. And I think that's going to bring things a little bit closer to what you're looking for. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Noticing that the hair on the left, right above my ear, just comes out a little bit more than it does in that initial line. And then I'm going to try and follow the contours as I work my way up towards the crown of my head. Now that I'm noticing, or now that I'm drawing that part, I'm noticing that the hairline needs to come out just a little bit on my drawing. So I'm going to adjust that right now. And you can do so as necessary as well. Alright, now hold this up so you can take a look in just a moment here. Okay. Alright. And also noticing the curve of my hair at my part on this side, so I'm going to try and reference that a little bit. And when I hold this up again, I drew in these lines around my cheeks a little bit more prominently than they're going to need to be moving forward, but it'll help you see what I'm getting at in terms of the structure and the plane of the face. Okay. So you'll notice the adjusted hairline, and then you'll notice those lines starting to talk a little bit about the cheekbones there. Okay. All right. So there's a few more adjustments that need to be made. I'm noticing that there are some additional marks that need to get cleaned up, and I'm going to go ahead and clean it up a little bit again, just to kind of avoid confusion. Okay. So this is actually a really great position to be in, because I haven't overcommitted to any particular aspect of this portrait at this point. So everything is still pretty much subject to change, even though things are getting a little bit closer to what I'm looking for. I should be willing to, we're about 40 minutes into this video, even at this point, be willing to make adjustments to things as necessary. So again, if you have an eye that's too high or too low, or the lips are too big or too small, you should feel free to be able to make those adjustments. You don't want to just commit to it because you spent a lot of time on the rendering of the contours. You want to make sure that it looks right. So, keep adjusting it until you get there, because you will eventually get there. It can be frustrating in the beginning, but if you continue to kind of whittle away at it, you'll be able to get your sea legs with it and get a feel for what needs to be done in order to get things closer to what you're looking for, or closer to what you're observing in the mirror. Okay? All right. I'm going to go ahead and lighten up those cheek lines a little bit. Now I'm noticing that I need to draw a little bit more information on the sides of my face to talk about the specific planes of the cheekbones more. Because right now it's just looking a little bit too generalized and could be adjusted to be more specific to what I'm seeing in the mirror. So go ahead and make some adjustments to the cheekbones, whether they protrude out or a little bit more sunken in. It just kind of depends on the structure of your face. But pay close attention to that at this point, and just draw in some preliminary marks to start to describe the sides of the face and things are going to be, that's going to be helpful for you. Okay? All right, and I'm going to do the same thing with my temples as well. So here and here. So I'm noticing that my forehead comes out, and the sides of my head need to be referenced. Even though I'm looking at a frontal view, I still do need to be talking about the planes of the face up here with the forehead versus the sides and the temples of my head. So I'm going to make a couple lines here in my drawing to describe it, so it feels like the drawing exists in three-dimensional space as opposed to just a flat surface, which your drawing inherently is. Okay. All right, and some of this stuff, again, isn't going to stay in the drawing for that long, but will help you talk a little bit about the structure that exists there. And a lot of this stuff can be cleaned up once you decide to incorporate shading into the drawing, which is something that I challenge all of you to begin to incorporate. So if you go back to the beginning of the semester, if you remember when we did the value scales for the master copy project, for this drawing, I would challenge you to try to incorporate a full range of value into your drawing. If you're able to do that, I think that the volume, the suggestion of three-dimensional form is going to be evident. Okay? So right before I get to that, I'm noticing that my shirt and my sweatshirt here haven't really been addressed in the drawing, so depending on what kind of clothing you're wearing, you want to make some kind of reference to what you're wearing if this is a head and shoulders portrait. And for the clothing, I would say it's not that important or that much of a priority to to render the clothing to the same degree as the portrait. Really what's important is the face having a strong likeness and the face being more observational. The clothing can be a little bit looser, and that can kind of help guide the viewer in terms of what's important when looking at the drawing. If you spend too much time on the clothing, it might take away focus from the face, which is, again, the most important part of your drawing. But you do want to address it and make sure there's something there. So I'm going to go ahead and look in the mirror here and just draw that sort of crew neck rounded off cuff of my t-shirt. And then I'm going to just very loosely draw in a few contour lines for my sweatshirt on both sides. Okay? And this is all dependent on what you're wearing in terms of what you put into the drawing. So this would be a good time to maybe give that area of the drawing a bit more attention that's been lacking so far. Because, we've been focusing on the important stuff, which is the face. All right. So I'll show you what we have here so far. And you'll notice just a little bit of a reference there. And again, it doesn't need to be much, but just a little something down there to activate the composition. If it's part of the drawing, it should be considered in some way. And again, not everything is going to be treated with the same degree of care and consideration, because there should be a kind of hierarchy in the drawing to direct the viewer to what's important. Okay. All right, so at this point, we're just going to go ahead and get a bit more specific with the ears. So depending on what you see in the mirror, now would be a really good time to address the specific details in the ears. And I apologize, my dogs are barking upstairs. There's cars going by, so try to disregard that if you can. Hopefully it'll pass soon. All right, so I'm putting the details in the ears. And you'll notice that most everything in the drawing right now is treated to a pretty similar degree of line weight. Like there isn't anything that's drawn with a particularly heavy line, and that's fine. That's fine. Again, I can go in with my eraser at any point and move things around and make adjustments as necessary. If I went too heavy too early, I'd probably be less inclined to making changes. Okay. Sorry, I had to silence my phone was going off there. Okay. All right. So hopefully you're in a well-lit environment. The next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about light. Light is a really important part of the drawing experience. The interaction of light and shadow actually eliminates the need for lines to describe the form of the face. So I have natural light coming in from the window, and then I have a chandelier above me lighting the space. So I have plenty of light to work with, and I'm actually noticing that this side of my face has a little bit more shadow because I'm facing away from that natural light source that I have here. I also have a light that's behind me. I probably should have shut the blinds before, but it's not diffusing things too dramatically or anything, so it's not going to affect things too much. And for the sake of demonstration, we're not going to worry about it. Okay, so I'm noticing more shadow on this side, and I'm also noticing more light on this side of my face. So what I try to do is identify the lightest light areas of my face and the darkest dark areas first, because it's a lot more difficult to figure out those mid-tone values, those in-between grays, than it is for me to immediately look at my face and say, okay, I can see there's a highlight right on the tip of my nose. I'm going to go ahead and draw that shape in. Just a really light little shape for where the highlight is going to go. Okay. I'm also noticing a little bit more intense light on my forehead here as well. So I can just very lightly draw that as a contour shape. That doesn't need to stay, as line. If I go in and smudge with some, tonal grays, that's going to eliminate the need for those contour edges to describe where the highlights are going to go. Okay, and then I'm noticing just a little bit of light on my cheek on this side, highlight around there. I'm just going to draw in a light shape for that. And next thing is to identify where I see the darkest dark areas. So I'm noticing areas in my hair that are a little bit darker in places. My eyebrows, which at this point are still pretty light. I've only drawn the contour edge of each eyebrow. And also that little bit of flare of the nostrils as well. So this would be a great opportunity to go in with your softer pencil, your 2B, your 4B, whatever you're working with, and start to establish those darker values, because the lightest lights and the darkest darks are going to help you figure out those midtones, the sort of in-between grays that are maybe a little bit lighter or slightly darker, but not quite as dark or as light as your lightest lights and your darkest darks. Okay. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now based on what I'm observing in the mirror. And I'm also seeing that I got to make a little bit of an adjustment to the flare of my nostrils. Look like I overwhelmed the area of the drawing with just a little bit too much tone. So again, feel free to make the adjustments as necessary. You might not need to at this point in your drawing. It really just sort of depends on what it looks like at this stage. Okay? And then I'll hold this up in just a moment for you to take a look at, and you can decide if that's going to work for you. I'm also noticing that the division between my upper and lower lip, there needs to be a little bit of a heavier line, because that part of the lip is a bit more recessed, and so it's going to be a little bit in shadow. Okay, so make sure you reference that if you need to. Okay. next thing I want to do is just go ahead and, with a little bit more pressure, go ahead and address the hair. And it all kind of depends on if you have lighter or darker hair. But not only that, depends on the lighting conditions that you're faced with. If you're stuck inside and you don't have any direct sunlight, I'll just put up, a regular floor lamp right in front of your space where you're working from to give you a nice sort of dramatic contrast between light and shadow. If you're working in a really evenly lit space, there's not going to be as much of that interaction between light and shadow. It all just kind of depends on your setup. What I have here, the conditions aren't totally ideal, but nevertheless, they are yielding some interesting interplays between light and shadow. So it just kind of depends on what your setup is and what you want to do, and that's going to kind of dictate the light and dark areas of your drawing. Okay, so give me just a minute here. I'm just going into the hair, and I might need to go ahead and sharpen that soft pencil because it has gotten a bit worn down with some of that heavier application. And now that I've established some of those darkest dark areas, I can go ahead and decrease my line weight or my pressure a little bit and just sort of fill in for my brown hair. And I'm just using really light, long strokes back and forth like this. I can kind of use my wrist as opposed to my fingers like that. It gives you a little bit more, elbow grease, I guess you could say. Or you can always pivot at the elbow as well. That works. Whatever you're most comfortable with. And that's not really something I've addressed at this point. Talked a little bit about it with this hand mirror here. If I did work with something like this, I would kind of have to keep things steady, which is certainly fine for the process. It's just you have to be a little bit more disciplined to hold your arms steady while you're drawing and looking back and forth. But the advantages of this, it's very easy to have, a direct, straight-on relationship versus this mirror that I have that's at a slight angle. That being said, a solution to this that would be very easy would be to, maybe put a shoebox underneath this on your space so that you have more of a direct one-to-one relationship with your mirror. Okay. Doesn't really matter. For the sake of demonstration, this works just fine. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and use some heavier pressure to go into my eyebrows now. And that's going to actually help make the face appear a bit more distinguished. And will actually help me go a little bit darker under the eyebrows than I've gone so far to, again, make reference to the recessed cavity of the eye sockets on both sides. Okay. So I'll show you what I have so far. Give me just a second here, and I will hold this up for you. All right, so probably noticing there's still a few discrepancies that are different from my reflection, but again, I can continue this process and make the adjustments necessary as I continue to move forward to bring things closer to what I'm actually seeing in my reflection. Okay. All right. Next thing I can do is I can work on the shadows that are on this side of my face. Again, we have some of those lines that account for the highlights that I observed earlier. So I'm just going to try to avoid some of those areas that have been blocked in for the highlights because I know that that's going to be a lighter area of the skin than the area that's in shadow. So I'm going to be focusing on this side of my face and just using kind of a side stroke motion with my pencil. Gives you a little bit more coverage. Just very lightly start to introduce some tone in there. Alright, I got to take my glasses off because I'm getting some strange shadows just from that overhead light. It doesn't help my vision because I don't have the greatest vision without glasses, but this does actually help me see the shadows in a more proximate way, so that can be helpful. If you wear glasses and you take them off for a moment, sometimes that can help you see the shadows and start to introduce them into the drawing. So I'm noticing the cheekbone. You can start to use that side stroke that I mentioned to go and shade the left-hand side, and then I might need to go just a little bit darker underneath my chin there. looks like that needs to be just a little bit heavier or more pronounced. Okay, now I'm noticing the same thing under my lips here and the side of my chin on this side of my face. You can just start to introduce some shadows in there. Okay, and I'm going to start to follow that contour edge of my chin with a little bit more pressure, even leading towards the right side of my reflection. Okay, it's because when I'm looking in the mirror here, it's just a little bit more pronounced than what I have. I'm also noticing a little bit of shadow on each side of my mouth here. So I'm going to go ahead and shade that in a bit. So that's going to help describe the tonal qualities based on the way that the light is interacting with my face. Okay, and then the left side of my reflection, I'm noticing that my nose has a bit of shadow because this side is obscured from the light that's coming in on this side. Okay, and like I said, with the eyebrows, once you darken them a bit, you can start to shade in the surrounding socket just a bit more because it needs to appear as though it sits further back in the face than the forehead and the cheekbones. So do that as you see fit, and then we'll move on here in just a moment. Okay, and then I'm just going to do a little bit of shading at the bridge of my nose there because I am noticing as the nose goes up, it starts to protrude a little bit more inward here before being more pronounced with the forehead. Okay. Alright, another thing that I'm noticing here is those initial cheekbone contours, now that I'm starting to introduce shadow, don't really need to be there quite as pronounced as they were initially. Okay. Alright, I'm also noticing a bit more intensity right here on my forehead and a little bit of shadow just as it moves back in space. So I'm going to take my finger and smudge it a little bit. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet about the eyes, we have a tendency to think that the white of the eye is actually white. And one thing that we oftentimes neglect is the fact that, if we look at our eyes in any given environment, the lighting situation is really going to dictate how light or how dark the eyes need to go. If I'm looking at my face in relative terms, I notice that the white of my eyes is actually a little bit darker than the highlights on my face, which seems kind of counterproductive or counterintuitive. You think, well, the white of the eye should be white. Why wouldn't it be the white of the paper? Well, because, we're dealing with the planes of the face, and a lot of times the forehead has a tendency to obstruct the light from the recessed cavity of the eye. So you might actually need to introduce a little bit of tone into the white of the eye in order for it to feel like it sits back a little bit more. If you're shading just around the eye and you leave it completely white around the iris and the pupil, it's going to pop out in a way that feels very unnatural. So I would say just go in, maybe pick up a little bit of that graphite from some of the darker areas, and then just introduce a little bit of smudging in the eye, and it'll start to sit back a little bit more. Okay, so now that I've introduced a little bit more shadow into that recessed cavity of the eye, I can put my glasses on. I don't have to worry about the specific lighting quite as much. But I am noticing that the iris and the pupil need to go a little bit darker at this point. Because of that shading that I introduced around the eye, it's getting a little confusing in terms of where the pupil and the iris is amidst all the other sort of mid-tone values that we've laid into the drawing. So I'm just going to go ahead and using my softer pencil, my 2B, I'm going to increase the line weight around the iris, and then I'm actually going to go a little bit darker for the pupil as well. And don't worry about the highlights on the inside of the eye at this stage. You can go back in with your eraser after you've done all this work and just pull up some highlight, and that'll be all you really need to do. So I'm going a little dark with the pupil here, doing a little bit more shading. Dog's barking outside again. Nothing we can do about that right now, and that's okay. Alright, now I'm going to start to kind of sculpt some of that tone that I've laid into the skin. I'm starting to try to transfer the lines of the tones of the shadows into something that is a bit more tonal and less linear. So even if you're laying in value with the side of your pencil, you can still see a lot of the individual pencil marks. So if you just take your finger, like I'm going to go into the cheek here, it's going to be right here in just a second, and I'm going to smudge that in. It's going to appear a little bit more tonal. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And if you have a chamois cloth, that works perfectly fine as well. You can use paper towel, a napkin, you know, an old rag, as long as it doesn't have any oils or anything like that in it, because that will affect the surface of your paper. So you just want to be careful, okay? And the nice advantage of having like a Reeves BFK or an Arches paper, or even this heavier watercolor paper, is I can dig in a little bit more than I could if I were using computer paper. Cardstock, I would say, is sufficient. If you do work with a lighter paper, it might be a bit more of a challenge in terms of smudging. So if you need to, you can always take some just regular masking tape and just tape down your surface so it doesn't move or buckle if you're smudging, okay? Just a small recommendation, not something that's necessarily required. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to observe that little highlight that I see in my iris. And if you need to have a scrap piece of paper with you, if your eraser gets too saturated with graphite, you know, just rub it out on another piece of paper and it should clean it up so that you can still yield, you know, highlights and things like that with it. The eraser is essentially a drawing tool, just like the pencil. So think about it as such. It's not just to correct mistakes, but it's also for making adjustments in areas of heavier tone. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to continue to smudge. And again, everything is subject to change until the very end of the drawing. You know, continue working it until you get it right. It's always worthwhile to do that. Okay. All right. Let's see. I can go a little bit darker with certain areas of the hair. And if you wanted to make a little bit of a reference to your surroundings or your background, feel free to do that. I'm not going to really address that in this video, but if you wanted to incorporate some kind of background in there, whatever you see in the mirror, that works to build the composition a little bit more. I'm just strictly focusing on the portrait for this. I think that's, you know, really the most important aspect here. But if you do have a lot of extra negative space, you know, it might be nice to put something in there. Okay. All right, and I will hold this up here in just a moment and show you what I have. Okay. So it's not going to be perfect, but it's a heck of a lot closer than it was probably about 20 minutes ago. So that's a good sign. We're continuing to build things, and we're building on the previous lines that we've laid down to hopefully get things to be more accurate to what you see when you're observing. Okay? So again, the more you work with it, the more you kind of sculpt with it, the more accurate things are going to be. And a lot of the tone that you lay into the drawing, a lot of those values, can allow you to eliminate some of those harder lines or harder edges. Okay, so I'm just making some adjustments, going a little bit darker with my jawline here, because I'm noticing just a slightly sharper edge than what was there before. Okay. Okay, making a couple little adjustments to the lips here. Okay, and then I'm just going to introduce a few shadows at the center point between the top and the bottom lip, just to talk a little bit about how the top lip sits on the bottom lip and how that obstructs a little bit of the light. Okay. Okay, and then I'm noticing with my shirt here, I just need to incorporate a little bit of a shadow around the cuff of the neckline there, just because it's a little bit too light. But again, don't feel like you need to labor over the clothing too much. It's just for additional compositional information. Again, we want to focus on the portrait because that's what's most important. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hold this up. We can take a look at what I have so far. All right, so we can see it's starting to develop a likeness. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. If I continue to work with this and continue sculpting it, it's gonna continue to look more like what I'm seeing in my reflection, which again is ultimately what we're looking for here. All right, I think that should just about do it. We can continue to fuss over the little details, but this should hopefully get you started. And you guys can feel free to email me at my email address, peide@carrollcc.edu. If you have any questions about this tutorial or the assignment. It's pretty basic, pretty straightforward. Have fun with it, and hopefully it should challenge you to maybe get outside your comfort zone a little bit and do something that's a little bit less design oriented than what we've been focusing on so far. So hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and again, let me know if you have any questions, and I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. Thanks.